Hello and welcome everyone joining me here in the studio. Peter Oborn, award-winning British journalist, columnist, author and commentator on politics for television and radio. Peter, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining me today.
Pleasure.
This week marks the 10th anniversary of the Rabaa massacre. For you as a British journalist, how did you remember that massacre?
As a terrible crime, terrible tragedy, and an awful full stop in the Arab Spring. I mean, so having a national army in Egypt turning its fire on people who were, unarmed civilians who were protesting was a bleak moment, and not just in the history of Egypt, but in the history of the Middle East, and actually in the history of the West, because Britain, America, basically went along with it.
And a few days ago, you attended the premiere of a documentary called Memories of a Massacre in London. How did you see the movie and the testimonies we all watched at it?
Yeah, well, several things came loud and clear from the movie. The first was the way in which the Morsi government, the first elected government which Egypt has ever had, was sabotaged after winning power democratically, and had some very telling evidence to show how that happened through the petrol stations and that there was an act of conscious and the failure of the security forces to come out and solve crimes. There was something very strange and troubling going on. The next thing we learned from it was, of course, how should one say, the collaboration. Maybe that's too strong a word, but how quickly the West, the United States, accepted the outcome. I mean, the condemnations were so flimsy and short-lived. How quickly arms sales to Egypt were resumed. And that was just a sign from the White House, Downing Street and elsewhere that however murderous President Sisi's regime was going to be, they were with the Sisi on this.
And when you say the President Morsi government was the only elected government, you don't consider Sisi as an elected president because the man won 2 elections?
Yes, they were after this awful event, and they were not. I don't think anybody regards those as real elections. I think people were terrified by then. They weren't going to come out and vote.
Yeah, and regarding the Western government, week before the Rabaa massacre, on the 3rd of July 2013, the day of the military coup, former Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, David Cameron, stated that the United Kingdom never support the army's intervention, but what we need happen now in Egypt is for democracy to flourish and for a real democratic transition to take place. After 10 years, what's your comment on this situation? Is the democracy being flourished in Egypt?
So when did David Cameron make this remark?
On the 3rd of July, a few hours after the military coup.
Yes. And of course, actually, John Kerry, I remember this, the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State, praised Sisi for restoring democracy. I mean, I don't know what universe John Kerry belongs to. There was no seriousness about what Mr. Cameron said. There was no effort by the British to use our influence to restore democracy in Egypt, and we turned a blind eye effectively to the military coup. I doubt we were behind it. I don't think it was one of the famous sort of MI6 generated coup d'etats such as happened in Iran in 1953, but it was we accepted the result, and Sisi was welcomed back. There's been no serious attempt by the British government to encourage democracy in Egypt, and I don't think we want democracy in Egypt. There's a pattern.
What kind of democracy, Peter? Because As far as I know, after the revolution in 2011, there is a plenty of occasion of democracy. Millions of Egyptian people participate in the constitution, in the parliament election, in the presidential election, and now British government's dealing with Sisi as an elected or democratic president. What kind of democracy the Western believe?
The West, it is a pattern all across the Middle East that the Western powers, Britain, America, and so on, prefer to deal with actual or in effect dictatorships. We saw this very recently with the case of Imran Khan, this is quite a similar case. Actually, there are interesting comparisons between Mohammed Morsi and Imran Khan. And when Imran Khan was removed from power, there were no protests from the British, and now that he's been sent to jail, nothing, and it's clearly trumped up charges. Nothing from Secretary of State Blinken in the United States, nothing for Foreign Secretary Cleverly here in Britain, and you can see that they are very relaxed to see an elected Prime Minister end up in jail.
Interest versus values.
Yes, you do. You read, as I do, the pronouncements of the British Foreign Secretary or the United States Secretary of State. They're always telling you that they're great believers in human rights and democracy and freedom.
This is the values.
Yeah.
But they go for their interests in the Middle East.
Yes, they have concluded that the interests of the big Western states in the Middle East are very much to see the survival of dictators.
In 2014, British Foreign Office issued a report on the deterioration of human rights in Egypt, describing what is happening as a repression and excessive use of force against protesters and criticizing the death sentence. However, a year later, in 2015, Sisi was welcomed for the first time in the United Kingdom by Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron. How do you describe this?
Well, it was. I went to a little demonstration outside Downing Street and spoke at it. I said, "Si, no," and we outside. And in fact, the Foreign Office lied to me. The British Foreign Office. I got wind that Mr. Sisi was President Sisi, Field Marshal Sisi. I'm not quite sure how we refer to him these days. Was coming, and I rang up about 4 days before, and I rang up the British Foreign Office and said there's no prospect that he's going to come to Britain. There are no plans and in the foreseeable future. 4 days later, there he was in Downing Street. So the British state is prepared to lie about its dealings with. So I felt cross about that, and I never received an apology from the British Foreign Office. But it sent a message simply that you're one of us. You, Mr. President Sisi, you're very welcome here in Britain. We can. I think it was quite low key, that visit. Do you remember? It wasn't a big state visit or anything like that. It was a little bit rushed, but nevertheless, it was a big statement that all's well. It's rather similar now to the way MBS is being welcomed back into the fold after the appalling fate of Jamal Khashoggi.
Yeah, and many of analysts and experts in the Middle East, they are criticizing the United Kingdom and United States and say there is a hypocrisy dealing with such a dictator in Egypt and the Middle East, and then teaching students here in the schools the British values regarding democracy and so on. Adding to this, in 2020, Britain said that it imposed sanctions on 11 individuals, including the former president of Gambia, Yahya Jammeh, in a coordinated step with the United States regarding human rights violations. So this is quite strange, Peter. Why did this not happen with the Egyptian regime or the Egyptian president?
Well, Britain has a very consistent foreign policy in the sense that we do protest against human rights violations, but only when they are committed by those who are considered to be enemies of the British state. When people who are considered to be friends of the British state or part of our system of alliances commit human rights violations, then we turn the blind eye. Another example, Alexei Navalny was sent to given 19 years, it clearly completely trumped up charges in Soviet Russia. Sorry, in Russia 4 or 5 days ago, and that was immediately denounced. But of course, he is that is Russia's an official enemy, so there's no difficulty about standing up for human rights in Russia. But remember, we claimed to, we supported the installation or the arrival of Vladimir Putin as Russian leader in 2000, right, 23 years ago. And that was greatly welcomed. There was a great sort of barrage of propaganda from the British state and friendly journalists who generally reflect the position of the British state. And of course, this was at the middle of the Second Chechenian War, which is probably the most barbarous war of the 21st century still. Or maybe Syria's overtaken it, but it was absolutely hideous. It was just after Grozny, the obliteration. And so we didn't have a human rights problem when we enabled or helped and smiled on the arrival of Putin as the Russian leader in 2000.
Okay, and there is a theory. Many journalists has wrote about it in the last 6 months. It's called "Egypt is too big to fail." With the economic collapse, with the political situation, with the human rights violation, it doesn't matter. Egypt is too big to fail. And the Western country will never allow Egypt to fail. Egypt as a state or Egypt as a Sisi regime. Do you believe in this theory?
I can see why the theory gets about, because I think there's no doubt the world, generally speaking, is a precarious situation. I mean, if you look along that seaboard, Syria is suffering. Egypt, a huge country, which, as you say, is another migration crisis waiting to happen. And so if there is an economic or collapse in Egypt, you'll get hundreds of thousands of people potentially trying to cross the Mediterranean, and that is an issue which the European Union will be very disturbed about, as will Britain. And so I can see the logic of this argument. It's too big to fail. Maybe we can allow Tunisia to get into a bit of difficulty. Even that's very serious because it has all kinds of consequences. But Egypt is a very significant country indeed.
And the Sisi regime depends on this theory, to be honest.
Yeah, there's a sort of mutually assured destruction, as it were, between the Sisi regime and the Western powers. Yeah,
because he marketed himself as the guardian of the borders. He prevented the illegal immigration from Africa, from North Africa, and even from Egypt.
Yes, I think that is. I'm sure that is a major negotiating point for him.
From your opinion, does Sisi achieve the stability of Egypt and the Middle East and the region?
Depends what sort of stability you mean. I mean,
from a Western perspective.
Well, I think that is the judgment which should be made in the chancellors of Europe, that he does. I mean, there's a horrible stasis. There's no democracy, there's no freedom, but there's also the regime is sort of safe and secure, and the population is under control. It's not exactly a walking advertisement for freedom and democracy, but it is a kind of very bleak stability put in place by an authoritarian state.
What do you mean by people under control? There is no revolution, no second round of Arab Spring?
Yeah, there's the Arab Spring has been put to bed. Western, it's a trading partner of the West. And you're always expecting another explosion like 2011, another Tahrir Square, but it's not happening. And the reason you expect it is because, according to all the statistics and the reports suggest, terrible poverty, getting worse.
Yeah, and why the Western countries and here in the United Kingdom, they are fearing from another round of Arab Spring?
Yes, whatever the next round will be.
And is it better to have a democratic regimes and governments in the Middle East after revolution. For example, government of Mohammed Morsi after the 2011 revolution, or dealing with a dictator like Sisi in Egypt?
I think it's a short-term calculation, which is the kind of calculation which politicians normally make, is that in the short term it's easier to have a dictator. In the long term, it was such a hopeful moment, the arrival of President Morsi. And you can build the institutions of democracy, and you have to fight. Egypt can then become a great power which stands for the values which the West claims to stand for. There is this paradox that the victory of the Morsi movement, as you might call it, was actually a victory for Western democracy. But the West didn't like a democracy which put in power somebody who they felt wrongly, I think, actually didn't represent their values, or they couldn't accept that they didn't put in, if Egypt, like so many other Arab states or states around the world, is only allowed to create one form of government, which is created by people who are trained by Western think tanks, who are sponsored by the United States, and accountable to Western powers. That kind of government is allowed to win democratic elections, but mysteriously, the people of Egypt and all kinds of don't terribly want to vote for that kind of government because it's not a real government.
Okay, Gulf countries support Sisi to overthrow President Morsi and then stay in power, and they consider the democratic experience in Egypt as a threat, as an Islamic threat from the Brotherhood. And even with the army in Egypt, they consider the Islamists as a threat until now, after 10 years. The question is about the Western government, Peter. Do Western government dealing with Islamists, winning elections and governing a democratic country as a threat?
That is beyond question the case, that so-called Islamists or Islamism is deemed to be, and you know this extremely well, some sort of mortal existential threat to the West. I've never seen it myself, and in fact I tend to think that Islamism is a very positive and profound force for good, but it's greatly distorted in Western narrative. If you look at a politician like Tony Blair or Boris Johnson in Britain, I mean, all of them, they will muddle up political Islam, like the Brotherhood or Ennahda, with Al Qaeda. They're all Islamists, and because they're, generally speaking, perfectly understandably, the mass of the population of the West don't know less than nothing about the Middle East. They're being scared with this idea that all these Islamist movements suddenly set about which pose an existential threat to the West. Actually, Islamist movements, I know lots of Islamists, and people who, the first thing that I've noticed about them is how much they admire Western democratic institutions. How much they admire Parliament, the rule of law, the free press. And it's fascinating that they admire and understand the importance of our institutions better than we do. And that is, I'm talking here about Islamists.
Okay, and my final question regarding the future. How do you see the future in Egypt with these old circumstances?
I feel that something terrible happened, going back to Rabah. Something terrible happened that day. It wasn't just the extinction of hope and the bloodshed, but also the message that that politics of the kind which we have here, political parties, mass movements, is not going to be allowed. And what my fear is, if you are not allowing political movements to flourish and gain power if they win elections, some other much darker forces will emerge, violence, effectively. And so the next time it happens, I've talked to a number of jihadists who came out of Egypt and ended up despising the Brotherhood because it went along with the due process. And next time they wouldn't do that. It'll be very, they'll burn the whole thing down. And that is what I fear.
Do you think it would be a political uprising or economic uprising?
Well, it'll be caused, I assume, like almost everything of this, by economics, mass unemployment, desperation. And then it will move. But will it go down the route of conventional politics, because that's what Morsi did, and he was killed as a result, and Rabat happened? Or will it take the form of jihadi movements, which would be so much more frightening?
Thank you very much, Peter Oppern. Thank you for joining me today.